Welcome to TigerStop. Today we're going to show you how to replace the motor and the belt. So the first thing that you want to do when getting into the amplifier is unplug the power. Very important. We're going to do that, then we're going to unplug our controller cable, our connection for the serial DB9, and lastly we will get our input-output I/O connection and unplug those. So we want to make sure those are all free and clear and that the cables are out of the way so we don't damage those. Next thing we're going to do is pull off the 4 acorn nuts on the back of the amplifier. And then we're going to pull the back plate here off. Now it does have a gasket on there that you may need to pry open. Okay, and then once you've got that off, we'll set that aside. So the amplifier box that's covering the motor actually consists of 2 parts. So you can actually see there's a couple of U channels here. One of these has the amplifier and all the connections on it. It's going to be the side with all the plugs. So the other side you can just slide right off. Once we're there, you'll see the end sensors are marked 1 and 2 and your encoder is marked 3. The encoder simply goes back to the back end of the motor. The only other plugs on the amplifier are the power to the motor. So we're going to go ahead and unplug these end sensors and encoder. Make sure they're free and clear and not catching on anything on the amplifier. And then we're going to pull it out. That'll free it up to where we can pull it out a little bit. Then we're able to unplug our motor connections, our 2 power, and our ground. Once those are clear, then we're actually good to pull the amplifier all of the way off and set aside. So we've got a zip tie holding the encoder and our number 2 end sensor together. We're just going to snip that and make sure that we're not damaging either of the wires. Now we do use these same Molexes. It is a good idea to mark your cables. Okay, so we've got our sensor 1 and sensor 2. We'll want to mark them because we're going to go ahead and pull the Molexes off, so we want to make sure we know which one we're doing here. So I'm just going to put a mark on the 1 and nothing on 2. That should be a little easier. And then we're going to pull this white Molex off. To do that, you have to actually press down into these gaps here where the connection is and then just pull it out. So what I'm going to do is get a very small straight slot screwdriver and some pliers so that I can pull those out pretty easily. I'm going to go with the longer one first. You'll see that 2 different lengths. Typically that's going to be the way that is, so I'm just going to go with the easy one first. So what I'm doing is taking that straight slot screwdriver and pushing into this slot here. So you just need to press firmly in there with a small straight slot screwdriver. And then you should be able to pull that out with little to no resistance. And then you just kind of work your way through. Now, do keep in mind the direction and then the colors of the cables that are in there. We're going to want to reverse that as we go back in. So we're just going to pull each of these out. And we have to do this because we're going to be pulling this cable through a small slot on the motor mount. You want to make sure that you're not pulling these out and damaging it because we will be putting these back in and they are directional. Okay. So there's one. When you're done, you should have all of these connections free and just kind of make sure that there's no real damage to them and we should be in good shape. Then you'll want to move on to the next one. Okay, so we're just going to do the same thing and repeat that here. So we'll want to set our Molexes aside so that we can use them again later. So because of the way this TigerStop is mounted up, to get the motor off, I have to slide this out, and because I'm going to be sliding the carriage out as well, I'm going to need some room. So I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the carriage on the TigerStop and slide that out a bit. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and loosen up the mounts on the TigerStop so that we can move it out. The point behind that is to give us enough room for when we pull the bolt out on the end, we actually have room to pull the motor and the carriage out as well. So we're going to go ahead and get to that. we'll loosen up these down here. So we're gonna pull this out slowly. Now it might catch, and you may have to make adjustments to the T-bolts that are on the bottom, just to make sure that you can continue to slide and make sure they're not catching. So now that that's free a little bit, and we'll have to continue to adjust it and pull the motor out as we pull this back. So we're gonna go ahead and loosen up the bolt on the end of the belt. Now you may have to break the sticker back here, and that's okay. That sticker there to show that that had not been done before. And once it has, then we know somebody has changed the belt tension. So you're just gonna go ahead and loosen this all the way out and pull this bolt completely out. You'll know that it's completely out when you can pull the end cap completely off. Now, when you're pulling the end cap off, be careful, as we do have the end sensor that is still connected on the inside here. So once we're completely free there, we'll be able to slide this out without any problem. Now, the cable should be circled around the bolt there, and then the end sensor should be free and clear. Now, you want to make sure there's no pinches in the cables, any of the spots where it comes through. Now, the cabling should sit in one of these slots here when it's all the way in. So it should not pinch, but if it does or has, then that could be part of the problem that you're having. So it's going to be very important when it goes back in that we don't have any contact there. If you want to take a look down here as well, not sure if you're going to be able to see that. You can see that our carriage is down here, and when we're tightening this bolt later, we're just pulling the tension on this. That's how we're getting the tension on the belt as that comes out. So we have a prescribed amount that we're gonna want to do a certain amount of turns to get the tension that we need on that belt. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and loosen up this Allen key bolt that's holding the motor in place. We've already pulled out the Allen key off the end, getting all of the tension off the belt. So now the only thing that's really holding this in place is this motor housing. So you can either just loosen that up or pull it all of the way out, depending on how you want to go about it. Okay, so once that's loose, you should be able to kind of slide the end out and get a gap here. Now be careful as you go, because we're going to be moving, these cables are going to be going through these holes, and they do have grommets on them, and we just want to make sure that we're not damaging them as we pull this out. So I'm going to go pretty slowly on this part here and make sure that as I move out, I have room. I'm not damaging the end sensor. I'm not damaging the belt. And the whole time we're looking for any kind of wear spots or damage that might be showing up. So once I'm free and I have the end sensor all of the way out, then I'm going to go ahead and pull these cables through. Again, trying to make sure that we're not damaging any of the ends that we're going to be plugging back in later. All right, there we go. So that end sensor obviously plugs in right here. This one goes down to the far end there. Now we're still attached at this belt, so you can't really just kind of set this down without being aware of that. So you're going to pull the belt the rest of the way out, and what that's going to actually do is pull the carriage out. So before I go too much further, I'm going to go ahead and pull the carriage the rest of the way off. So all I'm going to be pulling out is the internal carriage. So we're just pulling the flip away off here and going to set it aside. That way when we're pulling the carriage out, we don't have all of that attached to it. So you've just got a couple of 19mm bolts on either end here. Once you pull one off, you should be able to pull the whole thing through. Now be aware there are two nylon washers that are inset here, and you've got them in between the orange and the silver, and the silver and the orange here. So we want to make sure that we still have those when we're done, because when we put it back, those are very important to making sure everything is able to get tight properly and move the way we want it to. Just kind of set all of this aside. to put back later. So just making sure that all of our cables are clear still. We're gonna continue sliding this out a bit. And what we're doing now is we're pulling this carriage through, and you'll see on the outside here, this carriage is kind of moving through as we go. Now there should be some resistance. This should not be sloppy. So it should be, it should take a little force to pull this through. And then we've got that, and we've got our end sensor. So, or our idle end carriage. So we've got the whole assembly here, and now we're gonna go ahead and pull this apart. And we're gonna go over a bit of the components that make up the inside of the TigerStop. So we've got a better idea of how to put it back together and what to look for as far as troubleshooting goes. So on this end, now we're flipped completely over. We've got our idle end carriage, and that's got a couple of bearings on either side here, and the belt wraps around it. So that's gonna be, when you're pulling this all out and putting it back together, you generally want it bunched right up against the internal carriage, okay? So the internal carriage is this piece here. We're actually gonna flip it over in a moment to disconnect the belt from it, but a couple things to note. So we've got our internal glides that are here, and we've got tensioning bolts or tensioning screws that are on each end. And so we'll adjust those as we need to when we're going to put this back in to make sure that we have the proper tension with the internal carriage. A couple of other things to note. On top of the carriage here, we've got a fin that is not on the other side. So there's only one side of the carriage that has a fin. That fin is what actually goes through the end sensor to register that the TigerStop is at one end or the other. So we're gonna go ahead and flip this over real fast and note that there's two screws here, and those hold that internal clamp in, the belt clamp that holds the belt into place. So that'll be important to note when we're pulling the belt apart and putting that back together. We'll get down to this end here, and we've got the motor that we pulled out earlier. And we've still got the end sensor that's attached here, the motor, and then the pulley that goes to that. So to get this off, to get the belt off of the motor, we need to go to the carriage and pull that apart. So we'll do that now. Okay, so once these two are out, once these two screws are out, the belt clamp is going to be free. So what will happen is we'll be able to pull the belt out, and you can see that that's what that screw was going through. And then we'll have that belt clamp here in just a second. And this is the clamp that we had it connected to. And so those just go right into there and pull that, hold that belt in tight. Couple things to note when we're looking at our idle end carriage. We want to make sure that everything is straight and true, and that that carriage can spin freely. We'll also want to make sure that the threads in the back end here are clear of debris and look to be in good shape. With the carriage, we just want to make sure there's no excess wear on the glides that we have here. And really, even if there is a lot of wear, you just want to make sure that it's not uneven. And we can adjust that or fix that by just adjusting the tension on the glides once we put that back in. So just make sure that there's no undue wear there or that anything seems to be broken. Okay, we're putting the belt back on the motor, on the internal carriage, and the idle end carriage. So the most important part here is that everything lines up properly and we don't get the belt twisted. Kind of run the belt through the pulley on the motor, and you just want to give yourself plenty of room, plenty of slack and try and make sure that you're not catching too hard on the pulley itself. It's also important not to damage the end sensor as well. So we're kind of running that through. Now I want to run enough through to where I've got access to the top of the internal carriage, and that's how I want it to be so I can put the bolts in. So I'm going to run this through the carriage. And then once it goes through, I'm actually going to set up my idling carriage right behind it and loop around there as well. So once we're there, then we're pretty good. So now I just have to line up the belt and pull that motor away to where we can get that internal carriage all set up properly. We'll need the clamp, and then when you buy a new belt or a motor, you'll actually get a clamp tool that this slides into and pops up underneath. So let me grab that and we'll get that put together. We've got our belt clamp tool, and you can see that just kind of fits right in there. And the whole idea is that goes all the way through the carriage and we're able to hold this in place. So we just slide this through, and you want to look through the top to see where your holes are lined up. That's going to help quite a bit for getting the bolt started. Now, one trick that you can have if you're having problems holding up your belt clamp is just stick something underneath it inside the carriage there just to get it started. And you want to make sure you get both in and started before you tighten them up. And key here, because these clamps are holding, you want to make sure you get these nice and tight and don't have any slop. So we're going to check that before we move on. So we're able to pull that out. The clamp is still in there, and we're just going to make sure that that clamp is holding that belt in nice and tight, and we're in good shape. So again, we're going to try and keep this island carriage butted right up against the end here. We're going to follow this out and make sure that our belt did not get any loops or twists in it. So for now, I have to flip the whole thing over, and we're going to start by putting the idle end carriage in through the end of the TigerStop. So let me make sure I have enough room to do that. Again, it's important to note the orientation of your internal carriage. So again, we have the fins that are on the top, and those go through the end sensors. So if we don't have this set up properly, then you're not going to be able to see the end sensors. You won't be able to home, you won't be able to move properly. Important to note that you've got this opening here, so that's an easy way to figure out if you're oriented correctly. So we're going to go ahead and slide the internal carriage in. And as we go, we're going to check for tension. So once we get the glides started, and all we're looking to do is get them started and make sure that we don't have any play. Okay, and then we'll slide that in. And one thing that we'll want to do, so I'm going to move this to show you, is we're going to be tapping the corners here, and you should not hear any clicking. If you hear clicking, that's because these are not tight enough, and so you can just tension that. If you're tensioning these glides, and you can hear that clicking there, you really want to go maybe 1/8 of a turn at a time, and then push it back in and test it. So when we're testing here in TigerStop, we push through. There needs to be some force. You know, you have to have some strength to push that through. It shouldn't glide through very easily. Okay, and so we're going to slide that through the rest of the way and make sure there's no twisting in the belt as we go. So one thing that I like to do is use a screwdriver to put it through the carriage. That way you're not having to deal with those sharp edges there. And slide that all the way down to the end. As you get further along, you need to be careful because you're going to start binding up on your belt here. All right, so when we get to this point, we want to make sure that the end sensor is slid into the slot that's cut into the extrusion and that our belt is on the pulley. Okay, and we'll slide that in slowly. The other things to pay attention to are the end sensor cables that we had. So at this point, we're going to want to slide the cables back through the same slots that we had earlier, as that is your idle end sensor. And that lines up with this top hole. Make sure you're not pinching the cable or damaging those crimped ends. And then we'll run the motor end sensor through that bottom hole. Okay, and so we'll get that slid into place. Really all we need to do at this point is kind of snug everything up. And as you're going and tightening that up, you want to make sure that the belt is getting tightened as well. So you can almost pull the whole thing in from this side here, but then you just got to make sure that we get that last bolt in that holds that motor into place here. So once we're there, then we're in good shape here. We need to find our Molexes, the white Molex plugs that we had on these guys. And then we're going to go ahead and put those back in and get this TigerStop back together. We're just getting these wires back into our white Molex. So the color scheme that we're going with is white, red, black, and green. There is a small hook on the top of the metal that we need to grab to make it to where it does not freely come back out. What happens is you'll be sliding this onto the amplifier, and if that is not secure, then the wires will just pop right back out again and you won't have a good connection. So we just want to make sure that the Molex is nice and secure and that they're locked into place. So once we've got that, then we can set that aside and go put the end cap on for tightening the belt. So we'll run this over. Again, you want to loop this around however many times you need for how much excess you have here. And you want to make sure that the wire goes into this inset here. So we're going to slide the end sensor through and make sure that we're not pinching any wires as we go. And once we're set, now all we have to do is get the bolt on there to where we can tighten up the belt to get it to the correct tension. So we're tightening this up just to the point to where we can actually pull on the end cap and get some movement to where it'll actually come out, but without it staying out. We want to be able to pull on it and have it kind of bounce back. So you'll keep testing it as you go. Again, making sure there's no pinching of the cables or wires there. Once we've got it to where there's no play and we can pull it out just a little bit and have it come back, we say about a 1/16 of an inch, then we can start counting our turns. So this is a TS06. So we're gonna have to go see how many turns we do for this and then we'll start counting them out. So we're gonna start down at 1 point. We're just gonna count. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and a half. One thing we like to do is go another quarter turn and then bring it back that quarter turn. Okay, so our belt's in good. And now we can slide our amplifier and cover back on and then slide the TigerStop back into place. So we're going to take our amplifier and we're going to go ahead and slide this back on. Now we want to be careful again that we don't get to any of the sharp edges here on any of the cabling and we want to make sure everything fits in kind of smoothly. So we're going to slide the first threaded rod through and then the second threaded rod through. Now we'll want to pay attention and make sure that we're inside of this threaded rod, and we'll slide it up. So we're going to reverse the order. We're simply going to plug in the red and black from the motor, and that's on your motor 1 and motor 2. So we'll make sure that those get plugged in first. And then we're going to plug in our ground on our ground tree. And then we'll be able to slide this in place and get our encoder cables up. So we want to make sure that, again, that they're up and out of the way. And we've got our encoder cable from the motor. We'll slide that on. And then we've got our 1 and 2 end sensors. So there is 2. And here is 1. So once we've got those all plugged in and we're good, we're going to get the cover. And again, very important that we don't pinch any cables or run across any of the sharp edges here. So we'll get those first 2 threaded rods in. We'll make sure that we're on the right channel here. And again, very careful that we're not pinching any of the cabling here. So once that's in place, we're not pinching any of the cables, we're good. We can throw that back cover back on. And then just get our acorn nuts back on and tighten that up. So our TigerStop is back together. Now we can slide it back into place and tighten up our mounting bolts. Thanks for taking the time today to go through our video selection. We hope that it was helpful. If you have any suggestions, please contact us at service@tigerstop.com. Otherwise, have a great day.